Chapter 24. The ZANJAN Upheaval. The spark that had kindled the great conflagrations of Mazindaran and Neriz had already set aflame Zanjan, capital of the district of Kamsi, and its surroundings when the Bab met his death in Tabriz. Profound as was his sorrow at the sad and calamitous fate that had overtaken the heroes of Sheikh Tabasi, the news of the no less tragic sufferings that had been the lot of Vahid and his companions came as an added blow to the Bab's heart, already oppressed by the weight of manifold afflictions. The consciousness of the dangers that thickened around him, the memory of the indignity he endured when he was last conducted to Tabriz, the strain of a prolonged and rigorous captivity amidst the mountain fastnesses of Azerbaijan, the terrible butcheries that marked the closing stages of the Mazindaran and Neriz upheavals, the outrages to his faith wrought by the persecutors of the 7 martyrs of Tehran, even these were not all the troubles that beclouded the remaining days of his fast-ebbing life. He was already prostrated by the severity of these blows when the news of the happenings at Zanjan, which were then beginning to foreshadow their sad events, reached him, and served to consummate the anguish of his last days. What pangs must he have endured as the shadows of death were fast gathering about him! In every field, whether in the north or in the south, the champions of his faith had been subjected to undeserved sufferings, had been infamously deceived, had been robbed of their possessions, and had been inhumanely massacred. And now, as if to fill his cup of woes to overflowing, there broke forth the storm of Zanjan, the most violent and devastating of them all. I now proceed to relate the circumstances that have made of that event one of the most thrilling episodes in the history of this revelation. Its chief figure was Hujat-i Zanjani, whose name was Mullah Muhammad Ali, one of the ablest ecclesiastical dignitaries of his age, and certainly one of the most formidable champions of the cause. His father, Mullah Rahim-i Zanjani, was one of the leading mujtahids of Zanjan, and was greatly esteemed for his piety, his learning, and force of character. Mullah Muhammad Ali, surnamed Hujat, was born in the year AH 1227, AD 1812-13. From his very boyhood he showed such capacity that his father lavished the utmost care upon his education. His scholarship and keen intelligence excited the admiration of his friends, whilst his outspokenness and the strength of his character made him the terror of his adversaries. His father advised him not to return to Zanjan, where his enemies were conspiring against him. He accordingly decided to establish his residence in Hamadan, where he married one of his kinswomen, and lived there for about 2.5 years, when the news of his father's death decided him to leave for his native town. The ovation accorded him on his arrival inflamed the hostility of the ulamas, who, despite their avowed opposition, received at his hands every mark of consideration and kindness. From the pulpit to the masjid which his friends erected in his honor, he urged the vast throng that gathered to hear him to refrain from self-indulgence and to exercise moderation in all their acts. He ruthlessly suppressed every form of abuse, and by his example encouraged the people to adhere rigidly to the principles inculcated by the Koran. Such were the care and ability with which he taught his disciples that they surpassed in knowledge and understanding the recognized ulamas of Zanjan. For 17 years he pursued his meritorious labors and succeeded in purging the minds and hearts of his fellow townsmen from whatever seemed contrary to the spirit and teachings of their faith. When the call from Shiraz reached him, he dispatched his trusted messenger, Mullah Iskandar, to inquire into the claims of the new revelation, and such was his response to that message that his enemies were stirred to redouble their attacks upon him. Unable hitherto to disgrace him in the eyes of the government and the people, they now endeavored to denounce him as an advocate of heresy and a repudiator of all that is sacred and cherished in Islam. His reputation for justice, for piety, wisdom, and learning, they whispered to one another, has been such as to render it impossible for us to shake his position. When summoned to Tehran, in the presence of Muhammad Shah, was he not able, by his magnetic eloquence, to win him over to his side, and make of him one of his devoted admirers? Now, however, that he has so openly championed the cause of the Sayyidi Bab, we can surely succeed in obtaining from the government the order for his arrest and banishment from our town. They accordingly drew up a petition to Muhammad Shah, in which they sought by every device their malevolent and crafty minds could invent to discredit his name. While still professing himself a follower of our faith, they complained, he, by the aid of his disciples, was able to repudiate our authority. Now that he has identified himself with the cause of the Syedi-Bab, and won over to that hateful creed 2/3 of the inhabitants of Zanjan, what humiliation will he not inflict upon us? The concourse that throngs his gates, the whole masjid can no longer contain. Such is his influence, that the masjid that belonged to his father, and the one that has been built in his honor, have been connected and made into one edifice in order to accommodate the ever-increasing multitude that hastens eagerly to follow his lead in prayer. The time is fast approaching when not only Zanjan, but the neighboring villages also will have declared themselves his supporters. The Shah was greatly surprised at the tone and language with which the petitioners sought to arraign Hujat. He shared his astonishment with Mirza Nazar Ali, the Hakim Bashi, and recalled the glowing tribute which many a visitor to Zanjan had paid to the abilities and integrity of the accused. He decided to summon him, together with his opponents, to Tehran, in a special gathering at which he himself, together with Haji Mirza Akazi and the leading officials of the government, as well as a number of the recognized ulamas of Tehran, had assembled. He called upon the ecclesiastical leaders of Zanjan to indicate the claims they had advanced. Whatever questions they submitted to Hujat regarding the teachings of their faith, he answered in a manner that could not fail to win the unqualified admiration of his hearers, and to establish the sovereign's confidence in his innocence. The Shah expressed his entire satisfaction, and amply rewarded Hujat for the excellent manner in which he had succeeded in refuting the allegations of his enemies. He bade him return to Zanjan, and resume his valuable services to the cause of his people, assuring him that he would under all circumstances support him, and asking to be informed of any difficulty with which he might be faced in the future. His arrival at Zanjan was the signal for a fierce outburst on the part of his humiliated opponents. As the evidences of their hostility multiplied, the marks of devotion on the part of his friends and supporters correspondingly increased. Utterly disdainful of their machinations, he pursued his activity with unrelaxing zeal. The liberal principles which he unceasingly and fearlessly advocated struck at the very root of the fabric which a bigoted enemy had laboriously reared. They beheld with impotent fury the disruption of their authority and the collapse of their institutions. It was in those days that his special envoy, Mashhadi Ahmad, whom he had confidentially dispatched to Shiraz with a petition and gifts from him to the Bab, arrived at Zanjan, and delivered into his hands, while he was addressing his disciples, a sealed letter from his beloved. In the tablet he received, the Bab conferred upon him one of his own titles, that of Hujat, and urged him to proclaim from the pulpit, without the least reservation, the fundamental teachings of the Bab's faith. No sooner was he informed of the wishes of his master than he declared his resolve to devote himself to the immediate enforcement of whatever injunction that tablet contained. He immediately dismissed his disciples, bade them close their books, and declared his intention of discontinuing his courses of study. Of what profit, he said, are study and research to those who have already found the truth? And why strive after learning when he who is the object of all knowledge is made manifest? As soon as he attempted to lead the congregation in offering the Friday prayer, enjoined upon him by the Bab, the Imam Jumi, who had hitherto performed that duty, vehemently protested on the ground that this right was the exclusive privilege of his own forefathers, that it had been conferred upon him by his sovereign, and that no one, however exalted his station, could usurp it. That right, Hujat retorted, has been superseded by the authority with which the Qaim himself has invested me. I have been commanded by him to assume that function publicly, and I cannot allow any person to trespass upon that right. If attacked, I will take steps to defend myself and to protect the lives of my companions. His fearless insistence on the duty laid upon him by the Bab caused the ulamas of Zanjan to league themselves with the Imam Jumi and to lay their complaints before Haji Mirza Akazi, pleading that Hujat had challenged the validity of recognized institutions and trampled upon their rights. "We must either flee from this town with our families and belongings," they pleaded, "and leave him in sole charge of the destinies of its people, or obtain from Muhammad Shah an edict for his immediate expulsion from this country, for we firmly believe that to allow him to remain on its soil would be courting disaster." Though Haji Mirza Akazi in his heart distrusted the ecclesiastical order of his country and had a natural aversion to their beliefs and practices, he was forced eventually to yield to their pressing demands, and submitted the matter to Muhammad Shah, who ordered the transfer of Hujat from Zanjan to the capital. A Kurd named Khilij Khan was commissioned by the Shah to deliver the royal summons to Hujat. The Bab had meanwhile arrived in the neighborhood of Tehran on his way to Tabriz. Ere the arrival of the royal messenger at Zanjan, Hujat had sent one of his friends, a certain Khan Muhammad-i Tub-Chi, to his master, the Bab, with a petition in which he begged to be allowed to rescue him from the hands of the enemy. The Bab assured him that his deliverance the Almighty alone could achieve, and that no one could escape from his decree or evade his law. "As to your meeting with me," the Bab added, "it soon will take place in the world beyond, the home of unfading glory." The day Hujat received that message, Khilij Khan arrived at Zanjan, acquainted him with the orders he had received, and set out, accompanied by him, for the capital. Their arrival at Tehran coincided with the Bab's departure from the village of Kulain, where he had been detained for some days. The authorities, apprehensive lest a meeting between the Bab and Hujat might lead to fresh disturbances, had taken the necessary precautions to ensure the absence of the latter from Zanjan during the Bab's passage through that town. The companions, who were following Hujat at a distance whilst he was on his way to the capital, were urged by him to return and try to meet their master and assure him of their readiness to come to his rescue. On their way back to their homes, they encountered the Bab, who again expressed his desire that no one of the friends should attempt to deliver him from his captivity. He even directed them to tell the believers among their fellow townsmen not to press round him, but even to avoid him wherever he went. No sooner had that message been delivered to those who had gone out to welcome him on his approach to their own town than they began to grieve and deplore their fate. They could not, however, resist the impulse that drove them to march forth to meet him, forgetful of the desire he had expressed. As soon as they were met by the guards who were marching in advance of their captive, they were ruthlessly dispersed. On reaching a fork in the road, there arose an altercation between Muhammad Beg-i Charparchi and his colleague, who had been dispatched from Tehran to assist in conducting the Bab to Tabriz. Muhammad Beg insisted that the prisoner should be taken into the town, where he would be allowed to pass the night in the caravanserai of Mirza Masum-i Tabib, the father of Mirza Muhammad Ali-i Tabib, a martyr of the faith, before resuming their march to Azerbaijan. He pleaded that to pass the night outside the gate would be to expose their lives to danger, and would encourage their opponents to attempt an attack upon them. He eventually succeeded in convincing his colleague that he should conduct the Bab to the caravanserai. As they were passing through the streets, they were amazed to see the multitude that had crowded onto the housetops in their eagerness to catch a glimpse of the face of the prisoner. Mirza Masum, the former owner of the caravanserai, had lately died, and his eldest son, Mirza Muhammad Ali, the leading physician of Hamadan, who, though not a believer, was a true lover of the Bab, had arrived at Zanjan and was in mourning for his father. He lovingly received the Bab in the caravanserai he had specially prepared beforehand for the Bab's reception. That night he remained until a late hour in his presence and was completely won over to his cause. The same night that witnessed my conversion, I heard him subsequently relate, I arose ere break of day, lit my lantern, and proceeded by my father's attendant, directed my steps towards the caravanserai. The guards who were stationed at the entrance recognized me and allowed me to enter. The Bab was performing his ablutions when I was ushered into his presence. I was greatly impressed when I saw him absorbed in his devotions. A feeling of reverent joy filled my heart as I stood behind him and prayed. I myself prepared his tea and was offering it to him when he turned to me and bade me depart for Hamadan. This town, he said, will be thrown into a great tumult, and its streets will run with blood. I expressed my strong desire to be allowed to shed my blood in his path. He assured me that the hour of my martyrdom had not yet come, and bade me be resigned to whatever God might decree. At the hour of sunrise, as he mounted his horse and was preparing to depart, I begged to be allowed to follow him, but he advised me to remain, and assured me of his unfailing prayers. Resigning myself to his will, with regret, I watched him disappear from my sight. On his arrival at Tehran, Hujat was conducted into the presence of Haji Mirza Akazi, who, on behalf of the Shah and himself, expressed his annoyance at the intense hostility which his conduct had aroused among the ulamas of Zanjan. Muhammad Shah and I, he told him, are continually besieged by the oral as well as the written denunciations brought against you. I could scarcely believe their indictment relating to your desertion of the faith of your forefathers, nor is the Shah inclined to credit such assertions. I have been commanded by him to summon you to his capital, and to call upon you to refute such accusations. It grieves me to hear that a man whom I consider infinitely superior in knowledge and ability to the Sayyid Bab has chosen to identify himself with his creed. Not so, replied Hujat. God knows that if that same Sayyid were to entrust me with the meanest service in his household, I would deem it an honor such as the highest favors of my sovereign could never hope to surpass. This can never be, burst forth Haji Mirza Akazi. It is my firm and unalterable conviction, Hujat reaffirmed, that this Sayyid of Shiraz is the very one whose advent you yourself with all the peoples of the world are eagerly awaiting. He is our Lord, our promised deliverer. Haji Mirza Akazi reported the matter to Muhammad Shah, to whom he expressed his fears that to allow so formidable an adversary, whom the sovereign himself believed to be the most accomplished of the ulamas of his realm, to pursue unhindered the course of his activities would be a policy fraught with the gravest danger to the state. The Shah, disinclined to credit such reports, which he attributed to the malice and envy of the enemies of the accused, ordered that a special meeting be convened, at which he should be asked to vindicate his position in the presence of the assembled ulamas of the capital. Several meetings were held for that purpose, before each of which Hujat eloquently set forth the basic claims of his faith, and confounded the arguments of those who tried to oppose him. Is not the following tradition, he boldly declared, recognized alike by Shia and Sunni Islam? I leave amidst you my twin testimonies, the Book of God and my family. Has not the second of these testimonies, in your opinion, passed away, and is not our sole means of guidance, as a result, contained in the testimony of the sacred book? I appeal to you to measure every claim that either of us shall advance by the standard established in that book, and to regard it as the supreme authority whereby the righteousness of our argument can be judged. Unable to defend their case against him, they, as a last resort, ventured to ask him to produce a miracle whereby to establish the truth of their assertion. What greater miracle, he exclaimed, than that he should have enabled me to triumph alone and unaided by the simple power of my argument over the combined forces of the Mujtahids and Ulamas of Tehran. The masterly manner in which Hujat refuted the unsound claims advanced by his adversaries won for him the favor of his sovereign, who from that day forth was no longer swayed by the insinuations of his enemies. Although the entire company of the ulamas of Zanjan, as well as a number of the ecclesiastical leaders of Tehran, had declared him to be an infidel and condemned him to death, yet Muhammad Shah continued to bestow his favor upon him, and to assure him that he could rely on his support. Haji Mirza Akazi, though at heart unfriendly to Hujat, was unable, in the face of such unmistakable evidences of royal favor, to resist his influence openly, and by his frequent visits to his house, and by the gifts he lavished upon him, that deceitful minister sought to conceal his resentment and envy. Hujat was virtually a prisoner in Tehran. He was unable to go beyond the gates of the capital, nor was he allowed free intercourse with his friends. The believers among his fellow townsmen eventually determined to send a deputation and ask him for fresh instructions regarding their attitude towards the laws and principles of their faith. He charged them to observe with absolute loyalty the admonitions he had received from the Bab through the messengers he had sent to investigate his cause. He enumerated a series of observations, some of which constituted a definite departure from the established traditions of Islam. Sayyid Qasim-i Zanjani, he assured them, has been intimately connected with my master both in Shiraz and in Isfahan. He, as well as Mullah Iskandar and Mashhadi Ahmad, both of whom I sent to meet him, have positively declared that he himself is the first to practice the observances he has enjoined upon the faithful. It therefore behoves us, who are his supporters, to follow his noble example. These explicit instructions were no sooner read to his companions than they became inflamed with an irresistible desire to carry out his wishes. They enthusiastically set to work to enforce the laws of the new dispensation, and giving up their former customs and practices, unhesitatingly identified themselves with its claims. Even the little children were encouraged to follow scrupulously the admonitions of the Bab. Our beloved master, they were taught to say, himself is the first to practice them. Why should we, who are his privileged disciples, hesitate to make them the ruling principles of our lives? Hujat was still a captive in Tehran when the news of the siege of the fort at Abbasi reached him. He longed and deplored his inability to throw in his lot with those of his companions who were struggling with such splendid heroism for the emancipation of their faith. His sole consolation in those days was his close association with Baha'u'llah, from whom he received sustaining power that enabled him in the time to come to distinguish himself by deeds no less remarkable than those which that company had manifested in the darkest hours of their memorable struggle. He was still in Tehran when Muhammad Shah passed away, leaving the throne to his son Nasiruddin Shah. The Amir Nizam, the new Grand Vizier, decided to make Hujat's imprisonment more rigorous, and to seek, in the meantime, a way of destroying him. On being informed of the imminence of the danger that threatened his life, his captive decided to leave Tehran in disguise and join his companions, who eagerly awaited his return. His arrival at his native town, which a certain Kabila Vali Atta announced to his companions, was the signal for a tremendous demonstration of devoted loyalty on the part of his many admirers. They flocked out, men, women, and children, to welcome him and to renew their assurances of abiding and undiminished affection. The governor of Zanjan, Majdud Dawli, the maternal uncle of Nasiruddin Shah, astounded by the spontaneity of that ovation, ordered in the fury of his despair that the tongue of Kabila Vali Atta be immediately cut out. Though at heart he loathed Hujat, he pretended to be his friend and his well-wisher. He often visited him and showed him unbounded consideration, yet he was secretly conspiring against his life, and was waiting for the moment when he could strike the fatal blow. That smouldering hostility was soon to be fanned into flame by an incident that was of little importance in itself. The occasion was afforded when a quarrel suddenly broke out between two children of Zanjan, one of whom belonged to a kinsman of one of the companions of Hujat. The governor immediately ordered that child to be arrested and placed in strict confinement. A sum of money was offered by the believers to the governor in order to induce him to release his young prisoner. He refused their offer, whereupon they complained to Hujat, who vehemently protested. "That child," he wrote to the governor, "is too young to be held responsible for his behavior. If he deserves punishment, his father and not he should be made to suffer." Finding that the appeal had been ignored, he renewed his protest and entrusted it to the hands of one of his influential comrades, Mir Jalil, father of Sayyid Ashraf and martyr of the faith, directing him to present it in person to the governor. The guard stationed at the entrance of the house at first refused him admittance. Indignant at their refusal, he threatened to force his way through the gate and succeeded, by the mere threat of unsheathing his sword, in overcoming their resistance and in compelling the infuriated governor to release the child. The unconditional compliance of the governor with the demand of Mir Jalil stirred the furious indignation of the ulamas. They violently protested and deprecated his submission to the threats with which their opponents had sought to intimidate him. They expressed to him their fear that such a surrender on his part would encourage them to make still greater demands upon him, would enable them before long to assume the reins of authority and to exclude him from any share in the administration of the government. They eventually induced him to consent to the arrest of Hujat, an act which they were convinced would succeed in checking the progress of his influence. The governor reluctantly consented. He was repeatedly assured by the ulamas that his action would under no circumstances endanger the peace and security of the town. Two of their supporters, Pahlavan Asadullah and Pahlavan Safa Ali, both notorious for their brutality and prodigious strength, volunteered to seize Hujat and deliver him handcuffed to the governor. Each was promised a handsome reward in return for this service. Clad in their armor, with helmets on their heads, followed by a band of ruffians recruited from amongst the most degraded of the population, they set out to accomplish their purpose. The ulamas were in the meantime busily engaged in inciting the populace and encouraging them to reinforce their efforts. As soon as the emissaries arrived in the quarter in which Hujat was living, they were unexpectedly confronted by Mir Salah, one of his most formidable supporters, who, together with 7 of his armed companions, strenuously opposed their advance. He asked Asadullah whether he was bound, and on receiving from him an insulting answer, unsheathed his sword, and with a cry of "Ya Sahibu Saman," sprang upon him and wounded him in the forehead. Mir Salah's audacity, in spite of the heavy armor which his adversary was wearing, frightened the whole band, and caused them to flee in different directions. The cry which that stout-hearted defender of the faith raised on that day was heard for the first time in Zanjan, a cry that spread panic through the town. The governor was terrified by its tremendous force, and asked what that shout could mean, and whose voice had been able to raise it. He was gravely shaken when told that it was the watchword of Hujat's companions, with which they called for the assistance of the Qaim in their hour of distress. The remnants of that affrighted band encountered shortly after Sheikh Mohammed Tub Chi, whom they immediately recognized as one of their ablest adversaries. Finding him unarmed, they fell upon him, and, with an axe one of them was carrying, struck him and broke his head. They bore him to the governor. No sooner had they laid down the wounded man than a certain Syed Abul Qasim, one of the mujtahids of Zanjan, who was present, leaped forward and, with his penknife, stabbed him in the breast. The governor, too, unsheathing his sword, struck him on the mouth, and was followed by the attendants who, with the weapons they carried with them, completed the murder of their hapless victim. As their blows rained upon him, unmindful of his sufferings, he was heard to say, "I thank thee, O my God, for having vouchsafed me the crown of martyrdom." He was the first among the believers of Zanjan to lay down his life in the path of the cause. His death, which occurred on Friday, the 4th of Rajab, in the year A.H. 1266, the 16th of May, A.D. 1850, preceded by 45 days the martyrdom of Wahid, and by 55 days that of the Bab. The blood that was shed on that day, far from allaying the hostility of the enemy, served further to inflame their passions, and to reinforce their determination to subject to the same fate the rest of the companions. Encouraged by the governor's tacit approval of their expressed intentions, they resolved to put to death all upon whom they could lay their hands, without obtaining beforehand an express authorization from the government officials. They solemnly covenanted among themselves not to rest until they had extinguished the fire of what they deemed a shameless heresy. They compelled the governor to bid a crier proclaim throughout Zanjan that whoever was willing to endanger his life, to forfeit his property and expose his wife and children to misery and shame, should throw in his lot with Hujat and his companions, and that those desirous of ensuring the well-being and honor of themselves and their families should withdraw from the neighborhood in which those companions resided, and seek the shelter of the sovereign's protection. That warning immediately divided the inhabitants into 2 distinct camps, and severely tested the faith of those who were still wavering in their allegiance to the cause. It gave rise to the most pathetic scenes, caused the separation of fathers from their sons, and the estrangement of brothers and of kindred. Every tie of worldly affection seemed to be dissolving on that day, and the solemn pledges were forsaken in favor of a loyalty mightier and more sacred than any earthly allegiance. Zanjan fell a prey to the wildest excitement. The cry of distress, which members of divided families in a frenzy of despair raised to heaven, mingled with the blasphemous shouts which a threatening enemy hurled upon them. Shouts of exultation hailed at every turn those who, tearing themselves from their homes and kinsmen, enrolled themselves as willing supporters of the cause of Hujat. The camp of the enemy hummed with feverish activity in preparation for the great struggle upon which they had secretly determined. Reinforcements were rushed into the town from the neighboring villages at the command of its governor, and with the encouragement of the Mujtahids, the Sayyids, and the Ulamas who supported him. Undeterred by the growing tumult, Hujat ascended the pulpit, and with uplifted voice proclaimed to the congregation, "The hand of omnipotence has, in this day, separated truth from falsehood, and divided the light of guidance from the darkness of error. I am unwilling that, because of me, you should suffer injury. The one aim of the governor and of the ulamas who support him is to seize and kill me. They cherish no other ambition. They thirst for my blood and seek no one besides me. Whoever among you feels the least desire to safeguard his life against the perils with which we are beset, whoever is reluctant to offer his life for our cause, let him, ere it is too late, betake himself from this place and return whence he came." That day, more than 3,000 men were recruited by the governor from the surrounding villages of Zanjan. Meanwhile, Mir Salah, accompanied by a number of his comrades who observed the growing restiveness of their opponents, sought the presence of Hujat and urged him, as a precautionary measure, to transfer his residence to the fort of Ali Mardan Khan, adjacent to the quarter in which he was residing. Hujat gave his consent and ordered that their women and children, together with such provisions as they might require, be taken to the fort. Though they found it occupied by its owners, the companions eventually induced them to withdraw and gave them in exchange the houses in which they themselves had been dwelling. The enemy was meanwhile preparing for a violent attack upon them. No sooner had a detachment of their forces opened fire upon the barricades the companions had raised than Mir Riza, a Sayyid of exceptional courage, asked his leader to allow him to attempt to capture the governor and to bring him as a prisoner to the fort. Hujat, unwilling to comply with his request, advised him not to risk his life. The governor was so overcome with fear when informed of that Sayyid's intention that he decided to leave Zanjan immediately. He was, however, dissuaded from taking that course by a certain Sayyid who pleaded that his departure would be the signal for grave disturbances, such as would disgrace him in the sight of his superiors. The Sayyid himself set out, as evidence of his earnestness, to launch an offensive against the occupants of the fort. He had no sooner given the signal for attack and advanced at the head of a band of 30 of his comrades than he unexpectedly encountered 2 of his adversaries who were marching with drawn swords towards him. Believing that they intended to assail him, he, with the whole of his band, was suddenly seized with panic, straightway regained his home, and, forgetful of the assurances he had given to the governor, remained the whole day closeted within his room. Those who were with him promptly dispersed, renouncing the thought of pursuing the attack. They were subsequently informed that the 2 men they had encountered had no hostile intention against them, but were simply on their way to fulfill a commission with which they had been entrusted. That humiliating episode was soon followed by a number of similar attempts on the part of the supporters of the governor, all of which utterly failed to achieve their purpose. Every time they rushed to attack the fort, Hujat would order a few of his companions, who were 3,000 in number, to emerge from their retreat and scatter their forces. He never failed, every time he gave them such orders, to caution his fellow disciples against shedding unnecessarily the blood of their assailants. He constantly reminded them that their action was of a purely defensive character, and that their sole purpose was to preserve inviolate the security of their women and children. "We are commanded," he was frequently heard to observe, "not to wage holy war under any circumstances against the unbelievers, whatever be their attitude towards us." This state of affairs continued until the orders of the Amir Nizam reached one of the generals of the imperial army, Sadrud Dawli-i Isfahani by name, who had set out at the head of 2 regiments for Azerbaijan. The written orders of the Grand Vizier reached him in Khamsi, bidding him cancel his projected journey and proceed immediately to Zanjan, and there give his assistance to the forces that had been mustered by the government. "You have been commissioned by your sovereign," the Amir Nizam wrote him, "to subjugate the band of mischief-makers in and around Zanjan. It is your privilege to crush their hopes and exterminate their forces. So signal a service at so critical a moment will win for you the Shah's highest favor, no less than the applause and esteem of his people." This encouraging farman stirred the imagination of the ambitious Sadr-ud-Dawla. He marched instantly on Zanjan at the head of his 2 regiments, organized the forces which the governor placed at his disposal, and gave orders for a combined attack upon the fort and its defenders. The contest raged in the environs of the fort 3 days and 3 nights, in the course of which the besieged, under the direction of Hujat, resisted with splendid daring the fierce onslaught of their assailants. Neither their overwhelming numbers nor the superiority of their equipment and training could enable them to reduce the intrepid companions to an unconditional surrender. Undeterred by the fire of the cannon with which they were deluged, and forgetful of both sleep and hunger, they rushed in a headlong charge out of the fort, utterly unmindful of the perils incurred by such a sally. To the imprecations with which an opposing host greeted their appearance from their retreat, they shouted their answer of "Ya Sahibuz Saman," and, carried away by the spell which that invocation threw upon them, hurled themselves upon the enemy and scattered his forces. The frequency and success of these sallies demoralized their assailants and convinced them of the futility of their efforts. They were soon compelled to acknowledge their powerlessness to win a decisive victory. Sadr-ud-Dawla himself had to confess that after the lapse of 9 months of sustained fighting, of all the men who had originally belonged to his 2 regiments, no more than 30 crippled soldiers were left to support him. Filled with humiliation, he was forced eventually to admit his powerlessness to daunt the spirit of his opponents. He was degraded from his rank and gravely reprimanded by his sovereign. The hopes he had fondly cherished were, as a result of that defeat, irretrievably shattered. So abject a defeat struck dismay into the hearts of the people of Zanjan. Few were willing, after that disaster, to risk their lives in hopeless encounters. Only those who were compelled to fight ventured to renew their attacks upon the besieged. The brunt of the struggle was mainly borne by the regiments which were being successively dispatched from Tehran for that purpose, while the inhabitants of the town, and particularly the merchant class among them, profited greatly by the influx of such a large number of forces. The companions of Hujat suffered want and privation within the walls of the fort. Their supplies dwindled rapidly. Their only hope of receiving any food from outside laid in the efforts, often unsuccessful, of a few women who could manage, under various pretexts, to approach the fort and sell them at an exorbitant price the provisions they so sadly needed. Though oppressed by hunger and harassed by fierce and sudden onsets, they maintained with unflinching determination the defense of the fort. Sustained by hope that no amount of adversity could dim, they succeeded in erecting no less than 28 barricades, each of which was entrusted to the care of a group of 19 of their fellow disciples. At each barricade, 19 additional companions were stationed as sentinels, whose function it was to watch and report the movements of the enemy. They were frequently surprised by the voice of the crier, whom the enemy sent to the neighborhood of the fort to induce its occupants to desert Hujat and his cause. "The governor of the province," he would proclaim, "and the commander-in-chief too, are willing to forgive and extend a safe passage to whoever among you will decide to leave the fort and renounce his faith. Such a man will be amply rewarded by his sovereign, who, in addition to lavishing gifts upon him, will invest him with the dignity of noble rank. Both the Shah and his representatives have pledged their honor not to depart from the promise they have given." To this call, the besieged would, with one voice, return contemptuous and decisive replies. Further evidence of the spirit of sublime renunciation animating those valiant companions was afforded by the behavior of a village maiden who, of her own accord, threw in her lot with the band of women and children who had joined the defenders of the fort. Her name was Zainab, her home a tiny hamlet in the near neighborhood of Zanjan. She was comely and fair of face, was fired with a lofty faith, and endowed with intrepid courage. The sight of the trials and hardships which her men companions were made to endure stirred in her an irrepressible yearning to disguise herself in male attire and share in repulsing the repeated attacks of the enemy. Donning a tunic and wearing a headdress like those of her men companions, she cut off her locks, girt on a sword, and seizing a musket and a shield, introduced herself into their ranks. No one suspected her of being a maid when she leaped forward to take her place behind the barricade. As soon as the enemy charged, she bared her sword, and raising the cry of "Ya Sahibuz Saman," flung herself with incredible audacity upon the forces arrayed against her. Friend and foe marveled that day at a courage and resourcefulness, the eagle of which their eyes had scarcely ever beheld. Her enemies pronounced her the curse which an angry providence had hurled upon them. Overwhelmed with despair and abandoning their barricades, they fled in disgraceful rout before her. Hujat, who was watching the movements of the enemy from one of the turrets, recognized her and marveled at the prowess which that maiden was displaying. She had set out in pursuit of her assailants when he ordered his men to bid her return to the fort and give up the attempt. "No man," he was heard to say as he saw her plunge into the fire directed upon her by the enemy, "has shown himself capable of such vitality and courage." When questioned by him as to the motive of her behavior, she burst into tears and said, "My heart ached with pity and sorrow when I beheld the toil and sufferings of my fellow disciples. I advanced by an inner urge which I could not resist. I was afraid lest you would deny me the privilege of throwing in my lot with my men companions." "You are surely the same Zainab," Hujat asked her, "who volunteered to join the occupants of the fort?" "I am," she replied. "I can confidently assure you that no one has hitherto discovered my sex. You alone have recognized me. I adjure you by the Bab not to withhold from me that inestimable privilege, the crown of martyrdom, the one desire of my life." Hujat was profoundly impressed by the tone and manner of her appeal. He sought to calm the tumult in her soul, assured her of his prayers in her behalf, and gave her the name Rustam Ali as a mark of her noble courage. "This is the day of resurrection," he told her, "the day when all secrets shall be searched out," from the Quran 86:9. "Not by their outward appearance, but by the character of their beliefs and the manner of their lives, does God judge his creatures, be they men or women. Though a maiden of tender age and immature experience, you have displayed such vitality and resource as few men could hope to surpass." He granted her request and warned her not to exceed the bounds their faith had imposed upon them. "We are called upon to defend our lives," he reminded her, "against a treacherous assailant, and not to wage holy war against him." For a period of no less than 5 months, that maiden continued to withstand with unrivaled heroism the forces of the enemy. Disdainful of food and sleep, she toiled with fevered earnestness for the cause she most loved. She quickened, by the example of her splendid daring, the courage of the few who wavered, and reminded them of the duty each was expected to fulfill. The sword she wielded remained throughout that period by her side. In her brief intervals of sleep she was able to obtain, she was seen with her head resting upon her sword, and her shield serving as a covering for her body. Every one of her companions was assigned to a particular post, which he was expected to guard and defend, while that fearless maid alone was free to move in whatever direction she pleased. Always in the thick and forefront of the turmoil that raged around her, Zainab was ever ready to rush to the rescue of whatever post the assailant was threatening, and to lend her assistance to any one of those who needed either her encouragement or support. As the end of her life approached, her enemies discovered her secret, and continued, despite their knowledge that she was a maid, to dread her influence and to tremble at her approach. The shrill sound of her voice was sufficient to strike consternation into their hearts, and to fill them with despair. One day, seeing that her companions were being suddenly enveloped by the forces of the enemy, Zainab ran in distress to Hujat, and flinging herself at his feet, implored him with tearful eyes to allow her to rush forth to their aid. "My life, I feel, is nearing its end," she added. I may myself fall beneath the sword of the assailant. Forgive me, I entreat you, my trespasses, and intercede for me with my master, for whose sake I yearn to lay down my life." Hujat was too overcome with emotion to reply. Encouraged by his silence, which she interpreted to mean that he consented to grant her appeal, she leaped out of the gate, and raising 7 times the cry, "Ya Sahibus Saman," rushed to stay the hand that had already slain a number of her companions. "Why befoul by your deeds the fair name of Islam?" she shouted as she flung herself upon them. "Why flee abjectly from before our face, if you be speakers of truth?" She ran to the barricades which the enemy had erected, routed those who guarded the first 3 of the defences, and was engaging in overcoming the 4th, when, beneath a shower of bullets, she dropped dead upon the ground. Not a single voice among her opponents dared question her chastity or ignore the sublimity of her faith and the enduring traits of her character. Such was her devotion that after her death no less than 20 women of her acquaintance embraced the cause of the Bab. To them she had ceased to be the peasant girl they had known. She was the very incarnation of the noblest principles of human conduct, a living embodiment of the spirit which only a faith such as hers could manifest. The messengers who acted as intermediaries between Hujat and his companions were one day directed to inform the guards of the barricades to carry out the Bab's injunction to his followers and to repeat 19 times each night each of the following invocations: Allahu Akbar, God the Great; Allahu Azam, God the Most Great; Allahu Ajmal, God the Most Beauteous; Allahu Abha, God the Most Glorious; and Allahu Athar, God the Most Pure. The very night the behest was received, all the defenders of the barricades joined in shouting these words simultaneously. So loud and compelling was the cry that the enemy was rudely awakened from sleep, abandoned the camp in horror, and hurrying to the environs of the governor's residence, sought shelter in the neighboring houses. A few were so shocked with terror that they instantly dropped dead. A considerable number of the inhabitants of Zanjan fled panic-stricken to the adjoining villages. Many believed that stupendous uproar to be a sign heralding the day of judgment. To others it signified the sending forth on the part of Hujat of a fresh summons which they felt would be the prelude to a sudden offensive against them more terrible than any they had yet experienced. "What," Hujat was heard to remark when informed of the terror that sudden invocation had inspired, "if I had been permitted by my master to wage holy war against these cowardly miscreants? I am bidden by him to instill into men's hearts the ennobling principles of charity and love, and to refrain from all unnecessary violence. My aim and that of my companions is, and ever will be, to serve our sovereign loyally, and to be the well-wishers of his people. Had I chosen to follow in the footsteps of the Ulamas of Zanjan, I should, as long as I live, have continued to remain the object of the slavish adoration of this people. Never shall I be willing to barter for all the treasures and honors this world can give me the undying loyalty I bear his." The memory of that night still lingers in the minds of those who experienced its awe and terror. I have heard several eyewitnesses express in glowing terms the contrast between the tumult and disorder that reigned in the camp of the enemy and the atmosphere of reverent devotion that filled the fort. While those in the fort were invoking the name of God and praying for his guidance and mercy, their opponents, officers and men alike, were absorbed in acts of debauchery and shame. Though worn and exhausted, the occupants of the fort continued to observe their vigils and chant such anthems as the Bab had instructed them to repeat. The camp of the enemy at that same hour resounded with peals of noisy laughter, with imprecations and blasphemies. That night in particular, no sooner had the invocation pealed out than the dissolute officers, who were holding their wine glasses in their hands, dropped them instantly to the ground and rushed out headlong in bare feet, as if stunned by that stentorian outcry. Gambling tables were overturned in the midst of the disorder that ensued. Half-dressed and bareheaded, a number ran out into the wilderness, while others betook themselves in haste to the homes of the Ulamas and roused them from their sleep. Alarmed and overawed, these began to direct their fiercest invectives against one another for having kindled the fire of such great mischief. As soon as the enemy had discovered the purpose of that loud clamour, they returned to their posts, Reassured, though greatly humiliated by their experience, the officers directed a certain number of their men to lie in ambush and to fire in any direction from which those voices might again proceed. Every night they succeeded in this way in slaying a number of the companions. Undeterred by the losses they were repeatedly sustaining, Hujat's supporters continued to raise, with undiminished fervour, their invocation, despising the perils which the offering of the prayer involved. As their number diminished, the prayer grew louder and acquired added poignancy. Even the imminence of death was powerless to induce the intrepid defenders of the fort to give up what they deemed the noblest and most powerful reminder of their beloved. The contest was still raging when Hujat was moved to address his written message to Nasir-ed-Din Shah. "The subjects of your Imperial Majesty," he wrote him, "regard you both as their temporal ruler and as the supreme custodian of their faith. They appeal to you for justice and look upon you as the supreme protector of their rights. Our controversy primarily concerned the ulamas of Zanjan only, and under no circumstances involved either your government or people. I myself was summoned by your predecessor to Tehran, and was requested by him to set forth the basic claims of my faith. The late Shah was entirely satisfied and highly commended my efforts. I resigned myself to leave my home and settle in Tehran, with no other intention than that of abating the fury that raged round my person, and of extinguishing the fire which the mischief-makers had kindled. Though free to return to my home, I preferred to remain in the capital, wholly relying upon the justice of my sovereign. In the early days of your reign, the Amir Nizam, while the Mazindaran upheaval was still in progress, suspected me of treason and determined to destroy my life. Finding no one in Tehran able to protect me, I determined, in self-defense, to flee to Zanjan, where I resumed my labors and strove with all my might to advance the true interest of Islam. I was pursuing my work when Majd-ud-Dawla arose against me. I several times appealed to him to exercise moderation and justice, but he refused to grant my request. Instigated by the ulamas of Zanjan and encouraged by the adulation they lavished upon him, he determined to arrest me. My friends intervened and attempted to stay his hand. He continued to rouse the people against me, and they, in their turn, have acted in a manner that has led to the present situation. Your Majesty has until now refrained from extending his gracious assistance to us, who are the innocent victims of such ferocious cruelty. Our enemies have even sought to represent our cause, in the eyes of your Majesty, as a conspiracy against the authority with which you have been invested. Surely every unbiased observer will readily admit that we cherish in our hearts no such intention. Our sole aim is to advance the best interests of your government and people. I and my principal companions hold ourselves in readiness to leave for Tehran, that we may, in your presence as well as in that of our chief opponents, establish the soundness of our cause." Not content with his own petition, he bade his leading supporters address similar appeals to the Shah and stress his request for justice. No sooner had the messenger who was carrying those petitions to Tehran set out on his way than he was seized and brought back into the presence of the governor. Infuriated by the action of his opponents, he ordered the messenger to be immediately put to death. He destroyed the petitions, and instead wrote the Shah letters which he loaded with abuse and insult, and, adding the signatures of Hujat and his chief companions, dispatched them to Tehran. The Shah was so indignant after the perusal of these insolent petitions that he gave orders for the immediate dispatch of 2 regiments equipped with guns and munitions to Zanjan, commanding that not one supporter of Hujat be allowed to survive. The news of the Bab's martyrdom had meanwhile reached the hard-pressed occupants of the fort through Syed Hassan, brother of Syed Hussein, the Bab's amanuensis, who had arrived from Azerbaijan on his way to Qazvin. The news spread among the enemy, and was welcomed by them with shouts of wild delight. They hastened to ridicule and hurl their taunts at the efforts of his adherents. "For what reason," they cried in haughty scorn, "will you henceforth be willing to sacrifice yourselves? He in whose path you long to lay down your lives has himself fallen a victim to the bullets of a triumphant foe. His body is even now lost both to his enemies and his friends. Why persist in your stubbornness when a word is sufficient to deliver you from your woes? However much they strove to shake the confidence of the bereaved community, they failed in the end to induce the feeblest among them either to desert the fort or to recant his faith. The Amir Nizam was meanwhile urging his sovereign to dispatch further reinforcements to Zanjan. Muhammad Khan, the Amir Tuman, at the head of 5 regiments and equipped with a considerable amount of arms and munitions, was finally commissioned to demolish the fort and wipe out its occupants. During the 20 days that hostilities were suspended, Aziz Khan-i Mukri, surnamed Sadar-i Kul, who was on a military mission to Iravan, arrived at Zanjan and succeeded in meeting Hujat through his host Syed Ali Khan. The latter related to Aziz Khan the circumstances of a touching interview he had had with Hujat, when he had obtained all the information he required regarding the intentions and proposals of the besieged. Should the government, Hujat had told him, refuse to entertain my appeal, I am willing, with its permission, to depart with my family to a place beyond the confines of this land. Should it refuse to grant even this request and persist in attacking us, we should feel constrained to arise and defend ourselves. Aziz Khan assured Syed Ali Khan that he would do all in his power to induce the authorities to effect a speedy solution of this problem. No sooner had Syed Ali Khan retired than Aziz Khan was surprised by the Farash of the Amir Nizam, who had come to arrest Syed Ali Khan and to conduct him to the capital. He was seized with great fear and, in order to avert any suspicion from himself, began to abuse Hujat and to denounce him openly before the Farash. By this means he was able to ward off the danger that threatened his own life. The arrival of the Amir Tuman was the signal for the resumption of hostilities on a scale such as Zanjan had never before experienced. 17 regiments of cavalry and infantry had rallied to his standard and fought under his command. No less than 14 guns were, at his orders, directed against the fort. 5 additional regiments, which the Emir had recruited from the neighborhood, were being trained by him as reinforcements. The very night he arrived, he issued orders that the trumpets be sounded as a signal for the resumption of the attack. The officers in charge of his artillery were commanded to open fire instantly upon the besieged. The booming of the cannons, which could be heard distinctly at a distance of about 14 farsangs, had scarcely begun when Hujat ordered his companions to make use of the 2 guns they themselves had constructed. One of them was transported to a high position commanding the Amir's headquarters. A ball struck his tent and mortally wounded his steed. The enemy was meanwhile directing with unrelenting fury its fire upon the fort, and had succeeded in killing a large number of its occupants. As the days went by, it became increasingly evident that the forces under the command of the Amir Tuman, in spite of their great superiority in number, equipment, and training, were unable to achieve the victory they had fondly anticipated. The death of Farooq Khan, son of Yahya Khan and brother of Haji Suleiman Khan, one of the generals of the enemy's army, aroused the indignation of the Amir Nizam, who addressed a strongly worded communication to the commanding officer, reprimanding him for his failure to force the besieged to an unconditional surrender. "You have sullied the fair name of our country," he wrote him, "have demoralized the army, and have wasted the lives of its ablest officers." He was bidden enforce the strictest discipline among his subordinates, and cleanse his camp from every stain of debauchery and vice. He was, moreover, urged to take counsel with the chiefs of the people of Zanjan, and was warned that, failing to achieve his end, he would be degraded from his position. "If your combined endeavors," he added, "prove powerless to enforce their submission, I myself will proceed to Zanjan, and will order a wholesale massacre of its inhabitants, irrespective of their position or belief. A town that can bring so much humiliation to the Shah and distress to his people is utterly unworthy of the clemency of our sovereign." In a frenzy of despair, the Amir Tuman summoned all the Kharkudas and chiefs of the people, showed them the text of the letter, and by his earnest entreaties succeeded in arousing them to immediate action. The next day every able-bodied man in Zanjan had enlisted under the Amir Tuman's standard. Headed by their Kharkudas and preceded by 4 regiments, a vast multitude of people marched, to the sound of a flourish of trumpets and a beating of drums, in the direction of the fort. Undaunted by their clamour, the companions of Hujat raised simultaneously the cry of Ya Sahibuz Saman, then poured out of the gates and flung themselves upon them. That encounter was the fiercest and most desperate engagement that had yet been experienced. The flower of Hujat's supporters fell on that day victims to a ruthless carnage. Many a son was butchered in circumstances of unbridled cruelty under the eyes of his mother, while sisters gazed with horror and anguish upon the heads of their brothers raised on spears and brutally disfigured by the weapons of their foes. In the midst of a tumult in which the boisterous enthusiasm of the companions of Hujat faced the fury and barbarism of an exasperated enemy, the voices of women who were struggling side by side with the men could be heard from time to time animating the zeal of their fellow disciples. The victory that was miraculously achieved on that day was, in no small measure, attributable to the shouts of exultation which those women raised in the face of a mighty foe, which acquired added poignancy by their own acts of heroism and self-sacrifice. Disguised in the garb of men, some had rushed forward in their eagerness to supplant their fallen brethren, while the rest were seen carrying on their shoulders skins full of water, with which they strove to allay the thirst and revive the strength of the wounded. Confusion reigned meanwhile in the camp of the enemy. Deprived of water and distressed by defection in their ranks, they fought a losing battle, unable to retreat and impotent to conquer. No less than 300 companions quaffed that day the cup of martyrdom. One of Hujat's supporters was a man named Muhsin, whose function it was to sound the azan. His voice was endowed with a quality of warmth and richness that no man in the neighbourhood could equal. Its reverberation, as he summoned the faithful to prayer, could be distinctly felt as far as the adjoining villages, and penetrated the hearts of those who heard it. Oftentimes did the worshippers in that vicinity, in whose ears the voice of Muhsin was ringing, express their indignation at the charges of heresy imputed to Hujat and his friends. So loud grew their protestations that they eventually reached the ears of the leading Mujtahid of Zanjan, who, unable himself to impose silence upon them, implored the Amir Tuman to devise some means of eradicating from the minds of the people the belief in the piety and uprightness of Hujat and his companions. Day and night, he complained, I strive, through my public discourse, no less than by private converse with the people, to instill into their minds the conviction that that wretched band is the sworn enemy of the Prophet and the wrecker of his faith. The cry of that evil man Muhsin robs my words of their influence and nullifies my exertions. To exterminate that miserable wretch is surely your first obligation. The Amir refused at first to entertain his appeal. You and your like, he replied, are to be held responsible for having declared the necessity of waging holy war against them. We are but the servants of the government, and our duty is to obey the orders we receive. If you seek, however, to put an end to his life, you should be prepared to make the proper sacrifice. The Seyyid immediately understood the purpose of the Amir's allusion. He had no sooner regained his house than he sent him, by the hand of a messenger, the gift of 100 tumans. The Amir promptly ordered a number of his men, who were famed for their marksmanship, to lie in wait for Muhsin and shoot him when in the act of prayer. It was at the hour of dawn when, as he raised the cry of La ilaha illallah, and the footnote says, there is no God but God, that a bullet struck him in the mouth and killed him instantly. Hujat, as soon as he was informed of that cruel act, ordered another of his companions to ascend the turret and continue the prayer from where Muhsin had left off. Though his life was spared until the cessation of hostilities, he, together with certain of his brethren, was made to suffer eventually a death no less atrocious than that of his fellow disciple. As the days of the siege were drawing to a close, Hujat urged all those who were betrothed to celebrate their nuptials. For each unmarried youth among the besieged, he chose a spouse, and within the limits of the means at his disposal, contributed from his own purse whatever he could add to the comfort and gladness of the newly married. He sold all the jewels his wife possessed, and with the money provided whatever could be obtained to bring happiness and pleasure to those he had joined in wedlock. During more than 3 months these festivities continued, festivities which were intermingled with the terrors and hardships of a long protracted siege. How often did the clamour of an advancing foe drown the acclamations of joy with which bride and bridegroom greeted each other? How suddenly was the voice of merriment stilled by the cry of Ya Sahibuz Saman, that summoned the faithful to arise and repulse the invader. With what tenderness would the bride entreat the bridegroom to tarry a while longer beside her ere he rushed forth to win the crown of martyrdom. I can spare no time, he would reply. I must hasten to obtain the crown of glory. We shall surely meet again on the shores of the great beyond, the home of a blissful and eternal reunion. No less than 200 youths were joined in wedlock during those tumultuous days. Some a month, others a few days, and still others but a brief moment, were able to tarry undisturbed in the company of their brides. No one among them failed, as the beating of the drum announced the hour of his departure, to respond joyously to the call. Each and every one ungrudgingly offered himself as a sacrifice for his true beloved. All drank eventually the cup of martyrdom. No wonder the spot that has been the theatre of untold sufferings and has witnessed such heroism has been named Ard-i-Allah by the Bab, a title that has remained for all time linked with his own blessed name. And a footnote to Ard-i-Allah, the exalted spot, title given to Zanjan by the Bab. Among the companions was a certain Qabilai Abdul Baqi, the father of 7 sons, 5 of whom Hujat joined in wedlock. The nuptial ceremonies were hardly at an end when cries of terror suddenly announced the resumption of a fresh offensive against them. They sprang to their feet and, forsaking their loved ones, instantly rushed out to repulse the invader. All 5 fell in turn in the course of that encounter. The eldest of them, a youth greatly esteemed for his intelligence and of renowned courage, was captured and conducted into the presence of the Amir Tuman. "Lay him upon the ground," cried the infuriated Amir, "and kindle upon his breast, which dared nourish so great a love for Hujat, a fire that shall consume it." "Wretched man," burst forth the undaunted youth, "no flame that the hands of your men are able to kindle could destroy the love that glows in my heart." The praise of his beloved lingered on his lips until the last moment of his life. Among the women who distinguished themselves by the tenacity of their faith was one named Ashraf, the mother of Ashraf, who was newly married when the storm of Zanjan broke out. She was within the fort when she gave birth to her son, Ashraf. Both mother and child survived the massacre that marked the closing stages of that tragedy. Years afterwards, when her son had grown into a youth of great promise, he was involved in the persecutions that afflicted his brethren. Unable to persuade him to recant, his enemies endeavored to alarm his mother and convince her of the necessity of saving him ere it was too late from his fate. "I will disown you as my son," cried the mother when brought face to face with him, "if you incline your heart to such evil whisperings and allow them to turn you away from the truth." Faithful to his mother's admonitions, Ashraf met his death with intrepid calm. Though herself a witness to the cruelties inflicted on her son, she made no lamentation, neither did she shed a tear. This marvelous mother showed a courage and fortitude that amazed the perpetrators of that shameless deed. "I have now in mind," she exclaimed as she cast a parting glance at the corpse of her son, "the vow I made on the day of your birth while besieged in the fort of Ali Mardan Khan. I rejoice that you, the only son whom God gave me, have enabled me to redeem that pledge." My pen is powerless to portray, much less to render befitting tribute to, the consuming enthusiasm that glowed in those valiant hearts. Violent as were the winds of adversity, they were powerless to quench its flame. Men and women labored with unabating fervor to strengthen the defenses of the fort and reconstruct whatever the enemy had demolished. What leisure they could obtain was consecrated to prayer. Every thought, every desire was subordinated to the paramount necessity of guarding their stronghold against the onslaughts of the assailant. The part the women played in these operations was no less arduous than that accomplished by their men companions. Every woman, irrespective of rank and age, joined with energy in the common task. They sewed the garments, baked the bread, ministered to the sick and wounded, repaired the barricades, cleared away from the courts and terraces the balls and missiles fired upon them by the enemy, and last but not least, cheered the faint in heart and animated the faith of the wavering. Even the children joined in giving whatever assistance was in their power to the common cause, and seemed to be fired by an enthusiasm no less remarkable than that which their fathers and mothers displayed. Such was the spirit of solidarity that characterized their labors, and such the heroism of their acts, that the enemy was led to believe their number was no less than 10,000. It was generally conceded that a continual supply of provisions found its way in an unaccountable manner to the fort, and that fresh reinforcements were being steadily dispatched from Neriz, from Khorasan, and from Tabriz. The power of the besieged seemed to them as unshakable as ever, their resources inexhaustible. The Amir Tuman, exasperated by their unyielding tenacity and spurred by the rebukes and protestations of the authorities in Tehran, determined to resort to the abject weapons of treachery in order to exact the complete submission of the besieged. Firmly convinced of the futility of his efforts to face his opponents in the field honorably, he craftily called for the suspension of hostilities and gave currency to the report that the Shah had decided to abandon the whole enterprise. He represented this sovereign as having from the very beginning discountenanced the idea of extending his support to the forces that fought in Mazindaran and Neriz, and of having deplored the shedding of so much blood for so insignificant a cause. The people of Zanjan and the surrounding villages were led to believe that Nasir-ed-Din Shah had actually ordered the Amir Tuman to negotiate a friendly settlement of the issues between him and Hujat, and that it was his intention to put an end as speedily as possible to this unhappy state of affairs. Assured that the people had been deceived by his cunning plot, he drew up an appeal for peace, in which he assured Hujat of the sincerity of his intention of achieving a lasting settlement between him and his supporters. He accompanied that declaration with a sealed copy of the Koran as a testimony of the sacredness of his pledge. "My sovereign," he added, "has forgiven you. You, as well as your followers, I hereby solemnly declare to be under the protection of His Imperial Majesty. This Book of God is my witness that if any of you decide to come out of the fort, you will be safe from any danger." Hujat reverently received the Koran from the hand of the messenger, and as soon as he had read the appeal, bade its bearer inform his master that he would send an answer in the course of the following day. At night he gathered his chief companions and spoke to them of the misgivings he entertained as to the sincerity of the enemy's declarations. The treacheries of Mazindaran and Neriz are still vivid in our minds. That which was perpetrated against them, the same they purpose to perpetrate against us. In deference to the Koran, however, we shall respond to their invitation, and shall dispatch to their camp a number of our companions, that thereby their deceitfulness may be exposed. I have heard Ustad Mir Ali-i Haddad, who survived the massacre of Zanjan, relate the following. I was one of the 9 children, none of whom were more than 10 years old, who accompanied the delegation sent by Hujat to the Amir Tuman. The rest were men of over 80 years of age. Among them were Kabilai Maula Kuli Akadadash, Darvish Salah, Muhammad Rahim, and Muhammad. Darvish Salah was a most impressive figure, tall of stature, white-bearded, and of singular beauty. He was greatly esteemed for his honourable and just conduct. His intervention on behalf of the downtrodden invariably received the consideration and sympathy of the authorities concerned. He renounced, after his conversion, all the honours he had received, and though far advanced in age, enrolled himself among the defenders of the fort. He marched before us, carrying the sealed Koran, as we were led into the presence of the Amir Tuman. Reaching his tent, we stood at its entrance awaiting his orders. To our salute, he gave no response, and treated us with marked contempt. He kept us standing half an hour before he deigned to address us in a tone of severe reprimand. "A meaner and more shameless people than you," he cried in haughty scorn, "has never been seen." He had hurled his denunciations at us when one of the companions, the oldest and feeblest among them, begged to be allowed to say a few words to him, and, on obtaining his permission, spoke, unlettered though he was, in a manner that could not fail to excite our profound admiration. "God knows," he pleaded, "that we were and will ever remain loyal and law-abiding subjects of our sovereign, and with no other desire than to advance the true interest of his government and people. We have been grievously misrepresented by our ill-wishers. No one of the Shah's representatives was inclined to protect or befriend us. No one was found to plead our cause before us. We repeatedly appealed to him, but he ignored our entreaty and was deaf to our call. Our enemies, emboldened by the indifference which characterized the attitude of the ruling authorities, assailed us from every side, plundered our property, violated the honor of our wives and daughters, and captured our children. Undefended by our government and encompassed by our foes, we felt constrained to arise and defend our lives. The Amir Tuman turned to his lieutenant and asked him what action he would advise him to take. "I am at a loss," the Amir added, "as to the answer I should give this man. Were I at heart religious, I would unhesitatingly embrace his cause." "Nothing but the sword," replied his lieutenant, "will deliver us from the abomination of heresy." "I still hold the Koran in my hand," interposed Darvish Salah, "and carry the declaration which you of your own accord chose to make. Are the words we have just heard our reward for having responded to your appeal?" The Amir Tuman, in a burst of fury, ordered that Darvish Salah's beard be torn out, and that he, with those who were with him, be thrown into a dungeon. I and the rest of the children were scared and attempted to escape. Raising the cry of "Ya Sahibu Saman," we hurried in the direction of our barricades. Some of us were overtaken and made prisoners. As I was fleeing, the man who was pursuing me laid hold upon the hem of my garment. I tore myself away from him and managed to reach the gate that led to the approaches of the fort in a state of utter exhaustion. How great was my surprise when I saw one of the companions, a man named Imam Kuli, being savagely mutilated by the enemy. I was horrified as I gazed upon that scene, knowing as I did that on that very day the cessation of hostilities had been proclaimed and the most solemn pledges given that no acts of violence would be committed. I was soon informed that the victim had been betrayed by his brother, who, on the pretext of desiring to speak with him, had handed him over to his persecutors. I straightway hastened to Hujat, who lovingly received me, and wiping the dust from my face and clothing me with new garments, invited me to be seated by his side and bade me to tell him the fate of his companions. I described to him all that I had seen. "It is the tumult of the day of resurrection," he explained, "a tumult such as the world has never seen before. This is the day on which man shall fly from his brother and his mother and his father and his wife and his children." Quote from the Quran 80:34. This is the day when man, not content with having abandoned his brother, sacrifices his substance in order to shed the blood of his nearest kinsman. This is the day when every suckling woman shall forsake her suckling babe, and every woman that hath a burden in her womb shall cast her burden. And thou shalt see men drunken, yet are they not drunken, but it is the mighty chastisement of God. Quote from the Quran 22:2. Seating himself in the center of the Maidan, Hujat summoned his followers. On their arrival he arose, and standing erect in their midst, spoke to them these words: "I am well pleased with your unflinching endeavors, my beloved companions. Our enemies are bent upon our destruction. They harbor no other desire. Their intention was to trick you into coming out of the fort, and then to slaughter you mercilessly after their heart's desire. Finding that their treachery has been exposed, they have, in the fury of their rage, ill-treated and imprisoned the oldest and the youngest among you. It is clear that not until they capture this fort and scatter you will they lay down their arms and cease their persecutions against us. Your continued presence in this fort will eventually cause you to be taken captive by the enemy, who will of a certainty dishonor your wives and slay your children. Better is it, therefore, for you to make your escape in the middle of the night, and to take your wives and children with you. Let each one seek a place of safety until such time as this tyranny shall be overpassed. I shall remain alone to face the enemy. It were better that my death should allay their thirst for revenge than that you should all perish." The companions were moved to their very depths, and with tears in their eyes declared their firm resolve to remain to the end by his side. "We can never consent," they exclaimed, "to abandon you to the mercy of a murderous enemy. Our lives are not more precious than your life, neither are our families of a more noble descent than that of your kinsmen. Whatever calamity may befall you, it is what we shall welcome for ourselves." All except a few remained true to their pledge, these unable to bear the ever-increasing distress of a prolonged siege, and encouraged by the advice of Hujat himself, had given them, betook themselves to a place of safety outside the fort, thus separating themselves from the rest of their fellow disciples. Nerved to a resolve of despair, the Amir Tuman ordered all able-bodied men in Zanjan to assemble in the neighborhood of his camp, ready to receive his commands. He reorganized the forces of his regiments, appointed their officers, and added them to the host of fresh recruits that had massed in the town. He ordered no less than 16 regiments, each equipped with 10 guns, to march against the fort. 8 of these regiments were charged to attack the fort every forenoon, after which the remainder of the forces were to replace them in their offensive until the approach of evening. The Amir himself took the field and was seen in the forenoon of every day directing the efforts of his hosts, assuring them of the reward awaiting their success, and warning them of the punishment which, in the event of defeat, the sovereign would inflict upon them. For 1 whole month the siege continued. Not content with attacks by day, the enemy several times attacked them by night also. The fierceness of their onslaughts, the overwhelming force of their numbers, and the rapid succession of the onsets thinned the ranks of the companions and aggravated their distress. Reinforcements for the enemy continued to pour in from all directions, while the besieged languished in a state of misery and hunger. The Amir Nizam, meanwhile, decided to strengthen the hands of the Amir Tuman by the appointment of Hassan Ali Khan-i Karusi, who was commanded to march at the head of 2 Sunni regiments to Zanjan. His arrival was the signal for the concentration of the enemy's artillery on the fort. A tremendous bombardment threatened the structure with immediate destruction. It lasted for a number of days, during which the stronghold stood firm in spite of the increasing fire which was directed against it. The friends of Hujat displayed during those days a valor and skill that even their bitterest foes were compelled to admire. One day, while the bombardment was still in progress, a bullet struck Hujat in the right arm as he was performing his ablutions. Though he ordered his servant not to inform his wife of the wound he had received, yet such was the man's grief that he was powerless to conceal his emotion. His tears betrayed his distress, and no sooner had the wife of Hujat learned of the injury inflicted on her husband than she ran in distress and found him absorbed in prayer in a state of unruffled calm. Though bleeding profusely from his wound, his face retained its expression of undisturbed confidence. "Pardon this people, O God," he was heard to say, "for they know not what they do. Have mercy upon them, for they who have led them astray are alone responsible for the misdeeds the hands of this people have wrought." Hujat sought to calm the agitation of his wife and relatives at the sight of the blood that covered his body. "Rejoice," he told them, "for I am still with you, and desire you to be wholly resigned to God's will. What you now behold is but a drop compared to the ocean of afflictions that will be poured forth at the hour of my death. Whatever be his decree, it is our duty to acquiesce and bow down to his will." No sooner had the news that he had been wounded reached the companions than they laid down their arms and hastened to him. The enemy, meanwhile, taking advantage of the momentary absence of their adversaries, redoubled their attack upon the fort and were able to force their passage through its gate. That day they took captive no less than 100 of the women and children and plundered all their possessions. Despite the severity of that winter, these captives were left exposed in the open for no less than 15 days and nights to a biting cold such as Zanjan had rarely experienced. Clad in the thinnest of garments, with no covering to protect them, they were abandoned without food and shelter in the wilderness. Their only protection was the gauze that covered their heads, with which they sought in vain to shield their faces from the icy wind that blew mercilessly upon them. Crowds of women, most of whom were inferior to them in social position, flocked from the various quarters of Zanjan to the scene of their sufferings, and poured upon them contempt and ridicule. "You have now found your God," they scornfully exclaimed as they danced wildly around them, "and have been rewarded abundantly by him." They spat in their faces and heaped upon them the foulest invectives. The capture of the fort, their robbing Hujat's companions of their chief instrument of defense, failed either to daunt their spirit or discourage their efforts. All property on which the enemy could lay its hands was plundered, and the women and children who were left defenseless were made captives. The rest of the companions, together with the remaining women and children, crowded into the houses that lay in the close vicinity of Hujat's residence. They were divided into 5 companies, each consisting of 19 times 19 companions. From each of these companies 19 would rush forth together and, raising with one voice the cry of Ya Sahibuz Zaman, would fling themselves into the midst of the enemy and would succeed in scattering its forces. The uplifted voices of these 95 companions would alone prove sufficient to paralyze the efforts and crush the spirit of their assailants. This state of affairs continued for a few days, bringing in its wake both humiliation and loss to an enemy that had believed itself capable of achieving immediate and signal victory. Many were killed in the course of these encounters. Officers, to the distress of their superiors, were beginning to desert their posts. The captains of the artillery were abandoning their guns, whilst the rank and file of the army was demoralized and completely exhausted. The Amir Tuman was himself weary of the coercive measures to which he had been compelled to resort in order to maintain the discipline of his men and to keep unimpaired their efficiency and vigor. He was driven again to take counsel with the remainder of his officers and to seek a desperate remedy for a situation that was fraught with grave danger to his own life, no less than to that of the inhabitants of Zanjan. "I am weary," he confessed, "of the grim resistance of this people. They are evidently animated by a spirit which no amount of encouragement from our sovereign can hope to call forth in our own men. Such self-renunciation surely no one in the ranks of our army is able to manifest. No power that I can command is able to arouse my men from the slough of despair into which they have fallen. Whether they triumph or fail, these soldiers believe themselves doomed to eternal damnation." Their mature deliberations resulted in the decision to dig out underground passages from their site, which their camp occupied, to a place underneath the quarter in which the dwellings of Hujat's adherents were situated. They determined to blow up these houses, and by this means to force them to an unconditional surrender. For 1 whole month they labored to fill these underground passages with all manner of explosives, and continued at the same time to demolish with fiendish cruelty such houses as remained standing. Wishing to accelerate the work of destruction, the Amir Tuman ordered the officers in charge of his artillery to direct their fire upon Hujat's residence, as the buildings that intervened between that house and the camp of the enemy had been razed to the ground, there remaining no further obstacle in the way of its ultimate destruction. A section of his dwelling had already collapsed when Hujat, who was still living within its walls, turned to his wife Khadiji, who was holding Hadi, their baby, in their arms, and warned her that the day was fast approaching when she and her infant might be taken captive, and bade her be prepared for that day. She was giving vent to her distress when a cannonball struck the room which she occupied and killed her instantly. Her child, whom she was holding to her breast, fell into the brazier beside her, and shortly afterwards died of the injuries he had received in the house of Mirza Abul Qasim, the Mujtahid of Zanjan. Hujat, though filled with grief, refused to yield to idle sorrow. "The day whereon I found thy beloved one, O my God," he cried, "and recognized in him the manifestation of thy eternal spirit, I foresaw the woes that I should suffer for thee. Great as have been until now my sorrows, they can never compare with the agonies that I would willingly suffer in thy name. How can this miserable life of mine, the loss of my wife and of my child, and the sacrifice of the band of my kindred and companions, compare with the blessings which the recognition of thy manifestation has bestowed on me? Would that a myriad lives were mine. Would that I possessed the riches of the whole earth and its glory, that I might resign them all freely and joyously in thy path." The tragic loss their beloved leader had sustained, and the grievous wound inflicted upon him, distressed the companions of Hujat, and filled them with burning indignation. They determined to make a last and desperate effort to avenge the blood of their slaughtered brethren. Hujat, however, dissuaded them from making that attempt, and exhorted them not to hasten the issue of the conflict. He bade them resign themselves to the will of God, and to remain calm and steadfast to the end, whenever that end might come. As time went on, their number diminished, their sufferings multiplied, and the area within which they could feel secure was reduced. On the morning of the 5th of the month of Rabi'ul Awwal in the year 1267, the 8th of January, AD 1851, Hujat, who had already for 19 days endured the severe pain caused by his wound, was in the act of prayer and had fallen prostrate upon his face, invoking the name of the Bab, when suddenly he passed away. His sudden death came as a severe shock to his kindred and companions. Their grief at the passing of so able, so accomplished, and so inspiring a leader was profound. The loss was irreparable. Two of his companions, Tin Muhammad Wazir and Mir Rizai-i Sardar, straightway undertook, ere the enemy was made aware of his death, to inter his remains in a place which neither his kindred nor his friends could suspect. At midnight the body was borne to a room that belonged to Din Muhammad Wazir, where it received burial. They demolished that room in order to ensure the safety of the remains from destruction, and exercised the utmost care to maintain the secrecy of that spot. More than 500 women who survived that terrible tragedy were, immediately after the death of Hujat, gathered together in his house. His companions, in spite of the death of their leader, continued to face with undiminished zeal the forces of their assailants. Of the great multitude that had flocked to the standard of Hujat, there remained only 200 vigorous men. The rest either had died or were utterly incapacitated by the wounds they had received. The knowledge of the removal of so inspiring a leader nerved the enemy to resistance, and decided them to wipe out what still remained of the formidable forces they had been unable to subdue. They launched a general attack, fiercer and more determined than any previous one. Animated by the beating of drums and the sounding of trumpets, and encouraged by the shouts of exultation raised by the populace, they threw themselves upon the companions with unbridled ferocity, resolved not to rest until the whole company had been annihilated. In the face of this fierce onset, the companions raised once more the cry of Ya Sahibuz Saman, and rushed forth undismayed to continue the heroic struggle until all of them had been either slain or captured. That massacre had scarcely been perpetrated when the signal was given for a pillage unexampled in its scope and ferocity. Had not the Amir Tuman issued orders to spare what remained of the house and belongings of Hujat, and to refrain from any acts of violence against his kindred, even more dastardly attacks would have been made by his rapacious army. His intention was to inform the authorities in Tehran and to seek from them whatever advice they wished to give him. He failed, however, to restrain indefinitely the spirit of violence which animated his men. The ulamas of Zanjan, flushed with the victory that had cost them such exertion and loss of life, and which had involved to such an unprecedented degree their reputation and prestige, endeavored to incite the populace to commit every imaginable outrage against the lives of their men captives and the honor of their women. The sentinels who guarded the entrance to the house in which Hujat had been living were driven from their posts in the general tumult that ensued. The populace joined hands with the army to plunder the property and assail the persons of the few who still survived that memorable struggle. Neither the Amir Tuman nor the governor was able to allay the thirst for plunder and revenge which had seized the whole town. Order and discipline no longer existed in the midst of the... The governor of the province was, however, able to induce the officers of the army to gather together the captives into the house of a certain Haji Ghulam, and to keep them in custody until the arrival of fresh instructions from Tehran. The entire company were huddled together like sheep in that wretched place, exposed to the cold of a severe winter. The enclosure into which they were crowded was roofless and without furniture. For a few days they remained without food. From thence the women were removed to the house of a mujtahid named Mirza Abul Qasim, in the hope that he would induce them to recant, in return for which they would be offered their freedom. The greedy mujtahid, however, had, with the aid of his wives, his sisters and daughters, succeeded in seizing all they had been allowed to carry with them, had stripped them of their garments, clothed them with the meanest attire, and appropriated for himself whatever valuables he could find among their belongings. After suffering untold hardships, these women captives were allowed to join their relatives on condition that these would undertake full responsibility for their future behavior. The rest were dispersed throughout the neighboring villages, the inhabitants of which, unlike the people of Zanjan, welcomed the newcomers with treatment that was at once affectionate and genuine. The family of Hujat, however, were detained in Zanjan until the arrival of definite instructions from Tehran. As to the wounded, they were placed in custody until such time as the authorities in the capital should send directions as how they were to be treated. Meanwhile, the severity of the cold to which they were exposed and the cruelties they underwent was such that within a few days they had all perished. The rest of the captives were delivered by the Amir Tuman into the hands of the Qarusi, the Kamsi, and the Iraqi regiments, with orders that they be immediately executed. They were conducted in procession to the accompaniment of drums and trumpets to the camp where the army was stationed. All these regiments combined to add to the horror of the abominations perpetrated against the poor sufferers. Armed with their lances and spears, they flung themselves upon the 76 companions who still remained, piercing and mutilating their bodies with a savage ruthlessness that excelled the dark deeds of even the most refined torture-mongers of their race. The spirit of revenge which that day dominated those barbarous men passed all bounds. Regiment vied with regiment in committing the foulest atrocities which their ingenious minds could devise. They were preparing to swoop afresh upon their victims when a certain Haji Muhammad Hussein, father of Abba Basir, sprang to his feet and, raising the call of the Azan, thrilled the multitude that had gathered about him. Though in the hour of his death, such were the fervour and majesty with which he pealed out the words Allahu Akbar, that the entire Iraqi regiment immediately proclaimed their refusal to continue participating in such shameful deeds. Deserting their posts and raising the cry of Ya Ali, they fled from that place of horror and disgust. Accursed be the Amir Tuman, they were heard to exclaim as they turned their backs on that scene of bloodshed and horror. That wretch has deceived us. With devilish persistence he sought to convince us of this people's disloyalty to the Imam Ali and to his kindred. Never, though we all be slain, will we consent to assist in such criminal deeds. A number of these captives were blown from guns. Others were stripped naked. Ice-cold water was poured upon their bodies, and they were lashed severely. Still others were smeared with treacle and left to perish in the snow. Despite the shame and cruelties they were made to suffer, not one of these captives was known either to recant or to utter one angry word against his persecutors. Not even a whisper of discontent escaped their lips, nor did their countenances betray a shadow of regret or grief. No amount of adversity could succeed in darkening the light that shone in those faces. No words, however insulting, could disturb the serenity of their expressions. No sooner had the persecutors finished their work than they began to seek for the body of Hujat, the place of whose burial the companions had carefully concealed. Most inhuman tortures had proved powerless to induce them to disclose the identity of that spot. The governor, exasperated by the failure of his search, asked that the 7-year-old son of Hujat, whose name was Hussein, be brought to him, that he might attempt to induce him to disclose the secret. "My son," he said, as he gently caressed him, "I am filled with grief at the knowledge of all the afflictions that have been the lot of your parents. Not I, but the Mujtahids of Zanjan should be held responsible for the abominations that have been committed. I am now willing to accord the remains of your father a befitting burial, and wish to atone for the shameful deeds that have been perpetrated against him." By his gentle insinuations he succeeded in getting the child to reveal the secret, and thereupon he sent his men to fetch the body. No sooner had the object of his desire been delivered into his hands, and he ordered that it be dragged with a rope to the sound of drums and trumpets through the streets of Zanjan. For 3 days and 3 nights unspeakable injuries were heaped upon the body, which lay exposed to the eyes of the people in the Maidan. On the 3rd night it was reported that a number of horsemen had succeeded in carrying away the remnants of the corpse to a place of safety in the direction of Qazvin. As to Hujat's kinsmen, orders were received from Tehran to conduct them to Shiraz and to deliver them into the hands of the governor. There they languished in poverty and misery. Whatever possessions still remained to them the governor seized for himself, and condemned the victims of his rapacity to seek shelter in a ruined and dilapidated house. Hujat's youngest son, Mihdi, died of the privations he and his family were made to suffer, and was buried in the very midst of the ruins that had served as his shelter. I was privileged, 9 years after the termination of that memorable struggle, to visit Zanjan and witness the scene of those terrible butcheries. I beheld with grief and horror the ruins of the fort of Ali Mardan Khan, and trod the ground that had been saturated with the blood of its immortal defenders. I could discern on its gates and walls traces of the carnage that marked its surrender to the enemy, and could discover upon the very stones that had served as barricades stains of the blood that had been so profusely shed in that neighborhood. As to the number of those who fell in the course of these encounters, no accurate estimate has as yet been made. So numerous were those who participated in that struggle, and so prolonged the siege which they withstood, that to ascertain their names and number would be a task that I would hesitate to undertake. A tentative list of such names, which readers might do well to consult, has been prepared by Ismullahul Mim and Ismullahul Asad. Many and conflicting are the reports as to the exact number of those who struggled and fell under the banner of Hujat in Zanjan. Some have estimated that there were as many as 1,000 martyrs. According to others, they were more numerous. I have heard it stated that one of the companions of Hujat, who undertook to record the names of those who had suffered martyrdom, had left a written statement in which he had computed the number of those who had fallen prior to the death of Hujat to be 1,598, whilst those who had suffered martyrdom afterwards were thought to have been in all 202 persons. For the account I have related of the happenings of Zanjan, I am primarily indebted to Mirza Muhammad Ali Tabib Zanjani, to Abba Basir, and to Syed Ashraf, all martyrs of the faith, with each of whom I was closely acquainted. The rest of my narrative is based upon the manuscript which a certain Mullah Hussein Zanjani wrote and sent to the presence of Baha'u'llah, in which he recorded all the information he could glean from different sources regarding the events connected with that episode. What I have related of the struggle of Mazindaran has been similarly inspired, to a great extent, by the written account sent to the Holy Land by a certain Syed Abu Talib-i Shamirzadi, as well as by the brief survey prepared here by one of the believers named Mirza Haydar Ali-i Ardistani. I have, moreover, ascertained certain facts connected with that struggle from persons who actually participated in it, such as Mullah Muhammad Sadiq-i Muqaddas, Mullah Mirza Muhammad-i Furuqi, and Haji Abdul Majid, father of Badi and martyr to the faith. As to the events relating to the life and deeds of Wahid, I have obtained my information regarding what took place in Yazd from Rizar Ruh, who was one of his intimate companions. As to the later stages of that struggle in Neriz, my narrative is mainly drawn from such information as I could gather from the detailed account sent to the Holy Land by a believer of that town named Mullah Shafi, who had carefully investigated the matter and had reported it to Baha'u'llah. Whatever my pen has failed to record, future generations will, I hope, gather together and preserve for posterity. Many, I confess, are the gaps in this narrative for which I beg the indulgence of my readers. It is my earnest hope that these gaps may be filled by those who will, after me, arise to compile an exhaustive and befitting account of these stirring events, the significance of which we can as yet but dimly discern.